Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's wonderful to be at the opening ceremony for the APEC CEO Summit, Peru 2024. Earlier, we heard brilliant speeches given by Her Excellency, Madam President, and certainly President of the Central Bank of this country. And now let's move on to the very first panel of today. The topic is the state of the world. I'm Tian, the moderator for this panel. As we know, fear is a state of the world. Success could also be a state of the world. But ladies and gentlemen, today we are not discussing those. We are discussing the state of the world, which should be backed up by facts, data, analysis, and logic. And hopefully, eventually, we can collectively have some solutions to the current challenges. So it's my great honor to introduce our panelists who are together going to provide us with some real insights. I would read the name from the list, okay. Mohamed Kande, Global Chairman of PwC, good to see you, sir. Dr. Rebecca Maria, Executive Director of APEC Secretariat. Good to see you, Dr. Rebecca. Thank you for all the hard work. Last but not least, Luis Alberto Moreno, Managing Director from Allen & Co. and former President of the Inter-American Development Bank. Good to see you. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Now let's directly jump into the question. Dr. Rebecca, even though we are great friends, but I have to start by asking you, when there's tremendous skepticism about multilateralism, where is APEC?
Thank you very much, and I must thank the organizers for this kind of invitation to have me here this morning. Yeah, I mean, we hear a lot of anti-globalization rhetoric, folks diminishing multilateralism, but I really think that those are just scapegoats. Folks maybe fail to see the work that's being done. The APEC's strength really is in its power to convene meetings of relevant people, of politicians, of policymakers, of the business community. And I must say that of the various multilateral organizations, APEC stands out in its ability to engage directly with the private sector. And the private sector, through the APEC Business Advisory Council, has a seat in our meetings. That's not common. You know, it's common to have policymakers huddle and discuss things among themselves. But the value that APEC brings is this. It's the ability to bring the voice of the private sector. And beyond that, I must say, I just came off a breakfast meeting this morning. And yes, it was a meeting to discuss women's economic empowerment and the importance that women bring to the economic environment. But what we had this morning, and that really touched me, was the voice of a leader, a youth leader, a teenager from a little town called Tumbes, I'm sorry if I got it wrong, Tumbes, in the north. And she shared with us the importance of hearing the voice of these young people, and really, you know, talking about their challenges and bringing it to the surface. You feel it, so it's real, it's tangible. And that's what APEC brings to the table. I'll just leave it there. We're happy to engage further on some of your questions. Yeah.
Real and tangible. Mr. Kande, to you. I mean, you travel around the world for your clients and also your partners. What are some of the biggest concerns they're having about the state of the world today? Can you share with us now, briefly?
Yes, first of all, it's great to be here. This is my first APEC Summit, so I'm just very pleased.
Welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to see everybody here today. So, Tian, I would say that what we're hearing from many of the CEOs and the clients that we are working with today is uncertainty, but also long-term viability. What do I mean by that? You know, we did a survey earlier this year, a global CEO survey, where about 45% of the CEOs are saying that they're not sure the company will be around in 10 years. Think about what it means. the level of uncertainty that they're dealing with today, right? And now you think about technology evolution. What are we going to do about Gen AI? What are we going to do about all of the changes on the technology front? And think about some of the geopolitical tension and instability created around the world, climate transition and the implications on different businesses and supply chains. And those are all of the issues that we're seeing today. And that's what the feedback that we're hearing from many of the companies out there. But the same concerns can be looked at as opportunities. So if technology is advancing very fast, technology can serve companies very well for them to think about how should they run the companies differently. Climate transition, or even the transition to green energy, we have witnessed over the last 6 months trillions of dollars being invested just in that new ecosystem around semiconductors and green energy, etc. So that's a big opportunity because of the capital deployment that we're seeing. And also the ability to upgrade the workforce using technology today. But most importantly, I will say, what we're hearing from companies is the fact that with all of the changes happening around, it is an opportunity today to think about how they can even reinvent their business and do things differently. So nobody wants to let go of this opportunity, even if it is challenging. Good things will happen after that.
Thank you very much. I think the ladies and gentlemen sitting here who are business leaders from the region, they're really inventive and innovative, trying to come up with the best things out of a very challenging time. I don't know, maybe we should give some applause to our audience who are working very hard. I think so. Having said that, though, we also need to analyze a little bit deeper into these questions. Now, according to a recent research report I saw from PECC, which is related to the APEC, among the very top 5 challenges that top CEOs from companies from this region see, 4 of them are all related to geopolitics. Luis, you and I are longtime friends, so I throw that question, very difficult one, to you. Particularly, you are from the region, so you know the temperature and the pulse of our business community here. Please, Mr. Moreno.
Well, first of all, thank you very much and good morning, and it's always great to be here in Lima. I've had the privilege to be in the 3 different APEC summits, this being the 3rd one of which I participated. And of course, it's a very different world from the time that Lima and Peru held its first APEC meeting. And at the time, I think one could say that we were in an era of globalization that was accelerating and that was largely driven around efficiencies. Today's globalization is not that it has stopped, but rather that you have a moment in which geopolitics is at the center of that process of globalization. And this is creating, of course, reactions in every regard. And I think this is the moment we're in, clearly at a time where we have a set of other challenges of the world which are very deep. One of which I think is demographics. If you look at the next 20 years, the world will add something like 2 billion more people. But they're not coming from every country. They're coming from only maybe 10 or 12 countries. Some countries in Africa, countries like India, even the United States, China, which is starting already to see a decline in its population growth. And all of this puts a tremendous challenge because when one talks about the global south, historically, much of the growth can be explained by people entering into the labor market. And we're going to be in a moment where that demographics takes us to huge amounts of people entering the labor market and with a disruption that is taking place with AI that is going to be very difficult to scale up. We lived in a world where the differences in the global south and the global north around the digital divide were fundamentally a question of access. Access to bandwidth, access to hardware, be it through computers or telephones, whatever it was. And where the access to bandwidth was one in which you had low speed, high prices, and you need to do the reverse. You need to have higher bandwidth with bigger velocity and lower prices. So it's taken us to a moment where today these are going to be the challenges going forward, because it requires, as Mohamed was saying, essentially a set of skills to be able to use the AI in a way that it translates into more productivity. And I think this is, to me, one of the big areas that a group like this can begin to dwell on, because, as Mohamed was saying, there is no board meeting, there is no company at the micro level that is not looking for what to do with AI, what to do with the challenges of cyber, how to address them, and how to begin to make the best out of that.
Right. I see all of your answers touch on several important points, but if I could more, Madam Dr. Rebecca Moore is talking about multilateralism vis-a-vis fragmentation. Well, Mohamed, more on the technology side. And also Luis reminds us of the demographic changes, which is really transforming the landscape of the region. So may I dig deeper a little bit more on these topics? Dr. Rebecca, we see a lot of ecosystem popping up these days, ecosystems of groupings, of one region or another for one cause or another. So how will APEC, for example, remain attractive and also bring more synergy for political leaders and business leaders together? After all, the decision-making process have to involve important stakeholders together. Please.
Thank you. Like I said, that's the strength in APEC, the ability to convene, to bring different parties together, diverse voices, folks who may not necessarily agree with each other, but we have had that ability to bring them to the table. Just a step back a bit. APEC is not just, I know there's a lot of focus this week on the leaders' meetings, but APEC is not just about the summit. It's really a year-long process. It's really a continuous process. We have a clear vision that we've set for ourselves. Vision is a vision, but nothing comes out of it if you don't look to implement it. And APEC has, over the years, looked to implement at the very, not just at the 30,000 feet level of huge policies and broad policies, but really taking it down to the 3 feet level. Let me just give you one example. This is on diversity, for example. It's so easy to talk about diversity, inclusion, but what do you do at a level that people can relate and understand? And that's the strength of APEC. We have this big plan called the La Serena Roadmap for inclusive growth, women and inclusive growth. But you have to take it down. What we've done is we have actually a dashboard which looks at the various laws, regulations that we have in place, which make it a challenge for women to rise, for women to contribute more meaningfully. And these, it's evidence-based. We have the policy support unit in APEC capturing all these data and then sharing that with the ministers when they meet to say, here's where you've been doing well, and here's where you've not been doing well. Inevitably, access to finance, access to capital, access to market comes up. But very important for me is when we look at our regulations, and I keep repeating it because we have to keep repeating it until something gets done. And that's one of the values, one of the things that make it different for us. Of the 21 economies in APEC, 12 economies say it's okay to discriminate against women when it comes to access to capital. So clearly, these are things that, at the 30,000 feet level, we can say, oh, we need to look at women's economic empowerment. But when you dive deeper and look at what's happening on the ground, that's where it matters.
Right.
And this is what we bring to the table. This is what APEC does. We really look at its evidence-based discussions, not necessarily easy discussions. Some of those discussions are difficult for us to handle, but we bring it to the table nonetheless. We have those diverse voices in the room, whether it's the business community, whether it's civil society,
right.
Policymakers.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Now, Mr. Moreno, if you look at our region, this is really the growth engine of the world economy. You also see two largest economies, China and the United States, while at the same time, the so-called middle powers, in fact, they are very dynamic economies, and also the runner-ups, developing countries, as you said, the global south, whether you use that word or other words. So there's interesting synergy among them, but there's also some kind of competition, for example, between the two largest economies of the world. So how do you, from this part of the world, articulate this when you look at the state of the world and the existence of APEC in that regard?
Well, first of all, if you look at the history of trade patterns of this hemisphere over the last 30 years, they've changed significantly. And the biggest change is precisely the notion that the biggest trading part of the world has been Asia Pacific. And in this regard, all of the countries, especially of South America, began to change their trading partners, largely out of course, the connection to Asia and especially China. We are still today fundamentally a producer of natural resources. And not just any natural resources. Think for a minute, here you have in Peru, one of the largest producers of copper in the world. Copper, between just Chile and Peru, is over 40% of the world's supply. This is central for the whole energy transition. Then take lithium, 65% of the reserves of lithium of the world. There is no other region of the world that can feed the world the way South America can. We have, on the other hand, the biggest biodiversity of the world. A lot of change has been happening around, the so-called discussion around, the COPs, around climate change, but little has happened in terms of preserving biodiversity. And if you just simply look at the resources behind one and the other that the world has committed. Recently in Cali, in Colombia, there was the biodiversity COP, where as we speak today, there is the climate change COP taking place. And the reality there is no other bigger issue that the world has to face than climate change. We have over 60% of the biodiversity of the world. These are the carbon sinks that you're going to be looking at. It's a region that is largely peaceful. There is no ethnic problems. There's no wars. And at the same time, when you look at our trade with Asia, our biggest challenge has been to diversify it. I used to say to our Chinese friends, look, you basically are concentrated in 5 commodities. And yes, perhaps some soccer players that you're buying from Latin America to take to China. But aside from that, we need to learn how to diversify, how to see the flows of investment that, for instance, have been from Europe and from the United States for many, many decades into this region. So I think this is certainly a promising region. Like Julio Velarde was saying earlier, we've failed to do a lot of the structural reforms, and that's held back our growth. But that doesn't mean that if you look at the rising powers of the world, let's call it what will be the new G7 of the world 20 years from now, is going to come from some of these countries, especially some of the larger countries in this hemisphere like Brazil and Mexico.
May I remind you, it's not going to be just football players. It's also going to be a huge hub for Asia and Latin America. The Shanghai port, which reduced the time of transportation half already between the two continents. But having said that, let me go to Mr. Kande. Free trade, facilitation of investment is the core value. And can I say that, Dr. Rebecca, because you are the expert of APEC. That's why this mechanism exists from the very beginning. But now we hear about tariffs and things like that likely have the potential of really disturb the very core value of this mechanism. Global companies like yours and others, how are you digesting this, and what can be some of the consensus you are building to convey to the political leaders? I mean, APEC has ABAC, but also many global leaders, business community, are also bringing out your concerns. Tell us more about that, your thoughts.
Here's what we are witnessing. So as you mentioned, free trade is essential when it comes to APEC and collaboration between countries. But Tian, you mentioned the whole concept of ecosystems. The ecosystems are actually not concentrated in one country. They cross borders. Look at the flow of capital today. You mentioned biodiversity today that you have in Latin America. The rest of the world is looking for green energy. There is no technology, Gen AI adoption and all these things without computing power. We know that. And by the way, what computing power requires chips. More than 90% of the chips are manufactured in APEC. There's no Gen AI without APEC. As simple as that. But then you have all the data centers, the energy consumption and all this. Now there is a race around the world for many organizations and many companies to look for clean energy or green energy. And the money will follow the opportunities. And what we are seeing is that though, we see less and less trade barriers. We hear a lot of things on TV and with many of the politicians want trade barriers and all this. But the day-to-day companies that we're working with today, when they make the capital decisions where they're going to invest the money, they will invest the money where there is an economic return. And now, what we are witnessing, there is alignment between economic return, technology adoption, and also climate transition. Because everybody wants it now. Because there's a benefit not only to the world, but there's a benefit to their own companies today. So that's what we're seeing today. So the collaboration is happening between the companies themselves. Even if you have all the state-level type of tensions, we are seeing a lot of money moving around the world in a way that we haven't seen before. You mentioned about Europe. You mentioned about the US. Look at all the money coming to Latin America. Because you have one thing, biodiversity. And everybody's going to come because they are looking for that new commodity. That's about green energy.
I guess the politicians should really listen to the voices like this coming from the business community. Dr. Rebecca.
You know, one of our mantra in APEC is making it easier, faster, cheaper to do business. And how do you do that? I mean, folks talk about tariffs. Those are things that grab your attention. But what is happening in APEC as we have our discussions, it's about how do you facilitate business and really looking at issues like structural reform. You know, you can have zero tariffs. That's what I say. You can have zero tariffs. But if you cannot get your product or your service from point A to point B because of the whole lot of barriers, right, those tariff liberalization means nothing. So, you know, I keep repeating this. You know, trade agreements are good on paper, but to translate those agreements into workable solutions, things that matter to the business community, it's really about structural reform, getting your regulations in place, looking at the cost of doing business, looking at your investment agreements to see how facilitating they are. So those things matter. And let me say that in APEC, we have this opportunity. We have people in our offices of policymakers in the room really discussing this at a very granular level, and sharing best practices. I think we have systems in place and structures in place in APEC to have those conversations, to have that kind of sharing. We have one very important pillar in APEC for ecotech. It's for economic collaboration, for collaboration, for capacity building, technical assistance. And that's where a lot of the work that's done for structural reform is done. And if you look at how we've taken different aspects of trade and drilled it down to say, okay, here are the choke points. For example, when we look at supply chain connectivity, we have a dedicated group of policymakers working with the business community to look at choke points. What are the choke points that we need to really manage? The customs regulations, streamlining of processes, aligning our regulations. Those things really matter for the business community. And that's happening in APEC. Unfortunately, sometimes these messages don't get out, but the louder noises of tariff tensions and stuff, and the geopolitical tensions, that grabs the attention, not the work that we are doing behind closed doors. Maybe it's our messaging. So I'm glad I have that opportunity to sit here and tell you what we're doing. Yeah.
And as we said at the very beginning of this discussion, this is not a discussion about the state of mind, but the state of the world. Go to you, Mr. Moreno, about that. How do you see this supply chain? You mentioned about the raw materials, but earlier during the pandemic time, people worry about the supply chain because of pandemic disruptions. And now political barriers has become the worry that people have about global supply chain. I think this is such an important transformation we really need to recognize right now.
Well, I think certainly there's a geopolitical tension around supply chains, but what the pandemic taught everybody was that you needed to find ways to nearshore more of the production. And that's a fact of life independent of politics. And as a result, I think it's opened a lot of opportunities for a lot of countries to begin to drill down on this. Mohamed was talking, for instance, about a very important phenomenon that we have right now, which is around energy. Take the case of this hemisphere. This hemisphere has the cleanest energy matrix in the world. 70% of the energy comes basically from renewable sources, fundamentally hydro. And most countries in the world developed around agriculture. I think energy today, access to inexpensive energy is going to be a source of development. With Gen AI already, basically all the data that is out there has already been processed. The huge amount of data not processed yet is inside corporations, something Mohamed was referring to earlier. And the capacity to have energy at good prices is going to allow to begin to do kind of a jump where a hemisphere like this one, for instance, that essentially lost the train of the Industrial Revolution, could really enter significantly into the digital revolution. But it's going to have to be with lower cost of energy that will allow essentially to get into the data centers, and behind that, with all of the talent that powers that. The reality is that in the newer large language models are more and more expensive because they have to process higher amounts of data. Eventually they will, and this, by the way, has become the binding constraint for the development of Gen AI. It's not the chips, it's the cost of energy. And as a result, I see eventually it will be a time where you will have chips that are more energy efficiency, but we're not there yet. And in the meantime, this will allow us to power that. So if you look at all of these contexts, I think what is going to make countries successful or not towards the future? Clearly, it's going to be a question of reskilling. I think if one of the big issues that I often ask myself, back to the days of this first APEC meeting, we didn't look deep enough at the dislocations that were taking place at the level of countries and companies in terms of people that were left by the wayside because of competition and never had the chance to reskill. And this is what explains this huge blowback that we have today in the world. This blowback that basically, out of fear, people prefer and not move in the direction of globalization. And this is changing a lot of political behaviors.
Right.
We must be mindful of this. And there are ways to do today with AI, ways of reskilling using digital resources. And we have to massively invest in that. This education dynamic, but more importantly, the skills that come associated with it are going to be central.
Mr. Kande.
I add a little more comments on what Luis just said. We witness a lot of what is happening, but why certain behaviors have been displayed, as you just mentioned, in the large corporations? Because we are facing something today that we haven't faced in more than 40 years. You have scarcity, not only on the demand side of the supply chain, customers buying less, inflation, and issues like that. But at the same time, you have scarcity on the supply side, at both sides of the equation. And many of the large organizations in the world and the leaders themselves have not experienced an economic time where they had to manage scarcity both on the supply and the demand side. The second thing that's happening to them, when you talk about competition, whoever the companies are competing against to generate revenues, to get customers, to make money, and not the same companies anymore they're competing against on the supply side. The game is completely different. That is why you see dislocation and the money moving in a way that people are looking for resources, and they will transcend geographical barriers. That is why green energy, you see a lot of investment crossing borders today from the private sector, because they're going after the resources that they need today. It might not be oil. It will be actually many other resources. It could be cobalt, it could be copper, it could be lithium. That's what's happening today, and that is what's driving the behaviors of the leaders of the large corporations around the world. How do you deal with the situation that we have today, that nobody has seen for the last 40 years?
Great point, but may I just ask to follow up? We talk about the green transformation. It is excitingly taking place, by the way, in this part of the world, Asia Pacific. But once again, we see the old tricks of trade barriers coming as the block to the future. I mean, when we are articulating the two sides that are really need to be studied and dig deeper, how do you see this reality? I mean, the old tricks always come out and say, hey, I'm here. What's going on, Mr. Kande?
You know, I wish
What
I
to
knew.
do with that?
Well, you know what, it's so very interesting. That is why we need the private sector and the governments to work together, to be real, because otherwise it becomes lose-lose. You need the private sector to make sure that they have influence enough the government to ensure that, you know, the money can flow, the resources can flow, so that all boats can rise. This time that we have today, all the protectionism and the trade barriers, it's driven by the thing that I just mentioned, the scarcity. When you don't have enough resources, what do? You protect yourself. That's what's happening. But if you open the barriers and you actually give that access.
Or the perceived scarcity.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But the private sector is living this today. Every single day. Will I get my supplies? Today, for example, if you want to buy a car, even if people are not buying cars, you still have to wait for 2 months to get it. Why?
That's a great question.
Yeah. Even as we talk about the money and the supply side issues, I think we must factor in the people. When you talk of investing in some of these extractive technologies and work that we're doing, the extractive investments, we must weigh in the impact on the environment. We must weigh in the impact on people. And I think sometimes, for economies, I know that the environmental impact assessments is a must-do. Yes. But I think over and above that, you also need to do a social impact assessment, because some of these investments may cause displacements. And that is important. That causes a lot of upheaval in societies. And that's why I like what Peru is doing this year, this APEC for the People, really taking it down to the ground and saying, here's why we're having all these, the work that we're doing, all this engagement, it's for you. So how do you make sure they feel it? For me, it's like, how do you feel it on your skin, that this work that you're doing, that, these transitions, these energy transitions will matter to me, will matter to the average person. And therefore, that combination of environmental impact assessment and social impact assessment is so important, has to be done together.
Yeah. Mr. Moreno?
No, I think we can, as we dwell down on this, I just think for a minute, in this hemisphere alone, for instance, we've built over the years close to 200 gigawatts of power that is all renewable. The so-called hyperscalers are needing in the next 4 years something like 20 gigawatts of power that has to go behind the meter. Or on the other hand, equally, the tensions that this is going to create and the speed with which you can build all of that. In the United States, you had for decades the consumption of energy going down, and now it's going up the way this is going. This goes back to the question of scarcity, but also the question of opportunity. Because if you play this right, this is going to force a moment of more trade towards those that have as opposed to those that do not have. And these are the challenges, but it's going to be the set of opportunities for businesses to dwell into.
May I borrow your word, if we played it right? So let's talk about, we only have 10 minutes left, how to play it right, even though you've been providing solutions all along the way, this discussion. One of the things about AI is we are seeing so many different sides of it, Mr. Kande. For example, the digital divide. Now we have the AI divide, and also the ethics part of it. the technology part of it, the trade part of it, and also the technological blocks, quote unquote, part of it. So when you are saying we need to play it right, what is the play the right playbook that you have in mind for AI as an example? In the region, of course.
So,
you only have 2 minutes, not
2
like
minutes.
30 minutes.
So first of all, I come from the global south, okay? I was born in La Costa del Marfil, in Côte d'Ivoire, okay? And I went to school in Europe, I went to school in Canada, I went to school in the US and all this. I've seen what knowledge makes a difference in education. And now I see AI. If you were to ask me what I see as the power for AI, it's not the technology, it's not the semiconductors and all this. It's the fact that AI is going to democratize access to knowledge for everybody. And it's going to change the game when it's a game of skills, not a game of education, because people get a chance to have gone to the best universities in the world and all this. Then that definition of global north or global south could get away. It's a level playing field. Everybody gets to play. So even countries that are very heavy on natural resources now get a chance to play on the global stage because everybody gets access to the same knowledge.
If there is capacity building, of course, a precondition.
You need to have capacity building. You need to have skills, reskilling, things, that huge focus on skills.
But now we have a shot.
Yeah, but we have a shot at it, but I also think that we need to make some corrections because AI can also exacerbate digital divides. And I know there's a study that was recently done at the University of California where they showed that the AI has inherent biases and the gender bias is the very strongest. So we have to be very aware as policymakers, as we're adopting technologies, that we do not exacerbate the digital divide, whether it's the gender divide, whether it's the inter-economy divide, from the rural to urban. So those things are just as important as we plan our reskilling programs for each of our economies.
Yeah. Mr. Moreno, thank you for checking the time for me. I see you look at the big screen all the time, but this is really your home turf because you work as the president of Inter-American Development Bank for years. And how to provide the capacity building, not only just in Latin America, but also in our Asia-Pacific region, through development financing, not leading to debt problems, while at the same time looking at the growing trend very fast, Mr. Kande earlier already beautifully illustrated. How would make these things all happen at the same time? This is a mechanism our region really need to learn and do it well. So, Mr. Moreno.
Look, I would, before answering that, I think this whole multilateralism question has a profound need to change in governance. If you have, like the UN 200 some odd countries, and you decide that the 200 people are going to decide where do we go for lunch today, there'll be 50 opinions of the different restaurants. It's going to be Chinese, Japanese, Peruvian, whatever. This is the essential...
That's what me and my colleague had these days.
This is the essential problem of multilateralism is governance. And the voice and representation becomes central. For instance, I am convinced that in multilateral organizations that were built 80 plus years ago, there is no need to have resident boards, for instance. There is a need to have a system of decision-making that is far more fluid and that you're focused on essential issues as opposed to a lot of mandates that are given over time.
Yeah.
So that's the first part as it relates to a profound reflection that you need to have a multilateralism for this century. Some of that began in a discussion actually in the last UNGA meeting. Is perhaps a beginning, but it needs to really, really advance at a speed that we are simply not delivering today on the needs of our society. In terms of development finance, clearly, there needs to be far more opportunity, more flows, because behind development finance and behind development institutions, you have essentially smart money. You have a lot of technical people who over the years have seen projects that have failed or been successful and the learnings that come with them. And the other reality is that the sources of finance have been changing. Look at the Middle East today, is not only an exporter of oil, is a huge exporter of capital. And that is changing a lot what is happening in many countries around the world. So the question is, how do you combine that development finance by bringing other resources along, and at the end of the day, having something that is central for any government? Long tenors, this is long-term financing at lower prices, which allow countries to essentially front-load their investments and come out of a lot of need to be up to speed in its infrastructure, in its energy needs, as we were talking earlier, in the access to bandwidth. All of these things are central to deliver quickly. And if you don't have that development finance at the amounts that you need, you will always be in a situation where going at a snail's pace.
Right. The public-private partnership in this regard also extremely important. But if I could just follow up a little bit, since you are in global governance for long, we are not going to have a very prolonged debate about this. We had so many already over the years. But just, you see two very different opinions. One is, well, this is not useful for me anymore, therefore I don't want to be part of it. And the other is, okay, let's just throw the baby out together with the bathwater. And also, this is going to be the future. We're still going to hold on to it while we're going to maybe mend some of the fences. So you see this debate going on. What do you make of the efficiency of this debate vis-a-vis the real actions taking place?
Look, at the end of the day, those who argue for all the need not to have institutions like this are the same ones that wish to have institutions like this working differently. So the question is, how do you go into a debate like this in a more APEC type of format, where you are able to create a very fluid private-public sector type of dialogue? How do you address and get deep into the problems, and how you make decisions, and how you put the bureaucracy and the machines that are behind this more to the side and to focus on the outcomes?
Dr. Rebecca, Mr. Moreno, push all the pressure to you, APEC style.
Like I said, I mean, the fact that we can convene, we can bring different voices together. Can I know if there's some young people in the audience? Because I think the voices of the future.
We're all young at heart, by the way.
There's a whole bunch of them. Those are the young people from the voices of the future.
Hello,
voices,
over
there are 100
there.
of them. Those are the voices that matter. If our future is there, and their voices must be heard. And that's why I was so pleased this morning to have that one person in the room talk to us directly and talk to the president directly about the concerns of teenagers in the school system.
The future
generation. That's the future. Yeah, that's the future.
Right. But Mr. Kande, your thoughts on this?
My thoughts is that we talk a lot about what is happening today and some of the challenges that we're facing. We are the cusp of something new that is happening with the cost of intelligence coming down. Think about all the new value that will be created. Think about all the companies that don't even exist today. You remember the mobile internet in 1994 when it happened? Guess what? You have companies that didn't exist. Today they're giants. The next wave is coming, and it will give jobs to all of the folks that we have on the top here. You'll get jobs of your generation. Don't worry. It's coming.
All right, that's a big promise. But we got 1.5 minutes to go, so everybody, if you can, less than 30 seconds to wrap it up. We promise everybody a collective solution. Your takeaway today. Let's start from Mr. Moreno. A test, 30 seconds, my friend. Go ahead.
Look, it's always very easy to concentrate on all the problems that are affecting us, in all the challenges, but never forget that human beings wake every day up and try to do the best for themselves and their families. And that is what always makes me optimistic about humanity, is the capacity to overcome challenges. And what I would say is never let all of this noise distract you from where you're going, because that's what happens at the end, at the level of the firm, at the level of people, at the level of families.
Right.
And this is what matters.
Exactly, 30 seconds. Thank you. Mohamed?
So I'll add one more thing that is more at the personal level, because we have leaders in this room. Things are moving really, really fast outside of each one of our businesses or scope of responsibilities, and they're all connected. My advice is continue to learn, but learn fast. And learning, you cannot delegate to anybody. You have to do it yourself. Because you cannot solve a problem that you don't understand.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Last but not least.
Learning fast and listening, and I think that's the power of APEC. We have convening power, we bring in the necessary voices into the room despite all the noise, and the ability to learn, to absorb, and to share. I think that's the power that we bring to the table.
What an efficient panel, shall I say. Ladies and gentlemen, warm applause for these ladies and gentlemen on the stage. Thank you so much. And also, thank you so much for your innovative contributions to the solution. Thank you.